Hi, thanks for choosing to view my presentation. I'm Dan Hickey. I'm a professor with the Learning Sciences program at Indiana University. Today I'm going to speak about general artificial intelligence and what I call everyday educational assessment. Here I'm referring to the kinds of things that educators and course designers do to assess, to do formative and summative assessment of their students, and sometimes see whether or not their students are prepared for external tests. The point I want to make is that the cheap variation that is possible with generative AI in terms of generating items for people to choose from has massive untapped potential for improving this important aspect of education. I want to say thanks to the generous sponsors who've supported my work over the years, and especially thanks to Kinsu Lo, who's been a crucial graduate research assistant on this project. So I'll start with a caveat by pointing out that I'm a psychologist first and a technologist second. I have not been deeply immersed in AI, and I wasn't really until this pair of articles came out in December 2022. It really ruined my holiday break because I really just dove very deeply into it. The first one by Daniel Herman convinced many people, including myself, that education was going to be very, very different following the release of ChatGPT. And I was intrigued by the response that came out just a couple days later in this back and forth between what are the ultimate implications of generative AI and education. Starting in December, Kinshu and I really dug deep into ChatGPT and then later Bing and Bard. In particular, what we tried to do was to see whether it was possible to complete two innovative online courses using ChatGPT, but without actually seeming to learn anything. We concluded that, ChatGPT was amazing. It was quite remarkable what you could accomplish. Now, the unique design of these courses that I'll talk about more further on in this presentation meant that it would be extremely difficult to do a plausible, passable job in these courses and not learn anything. And in particular, it was clear that in many cases it was possible that the investigation that you might do with ChatGPT or let ChatGPT do for you, sort of moving that information over into the course, um, you could learn quite a bit from ChatGPT. It knew quite a bit about both of these topics. In one case, learning and cognition, and the other case, educational assessment. Now, we learned quite a bit of other things along the way. We learned that much of the advice that was emerging at the time for educators was quite simply wrong. Um, Many people were telling educators that if they asked students questions about things that were local or personal or recent, that would thwart ChatGPT. Well, the students quickly learned that you could just feed that information into ChatGPT. Um, Case in point, in the widely cited examples of ChatGPT hallucinating scholarly references. Indeed, it does hallucinate. It does it very, very well. But if you give ChatGPT the abstract of a scholarly article, it will do a fine job of applying that article to really whatever topic you ask, even relatively esoteric ones. So case in point, one of these blog posts features a 3,500 word literature review paper where I took the readings from the Learning and Cognition course and applied them using ChatGPT to teaching cybersecurity using a digital range. Um, so that was really quite eye-opening. We learned quite a bit. Frankly, began getting a little overwhelmed by just the vast scope of questions that were emerging. And indeed, in the ensuing months, in 2023, we saw just an explosion that's almost unprecedented, certainly in the history of education, if not in technology. The amount of attention and investigation in the media and in the scholarly literature and in reports, you name it, everybody was talking about it. And here's just a few of these examples. And I frankly found it quite difficult just to keep up with this explosion of information and elected that probably it was a better use of my time to narrow my focus to what I knew best. So I decided to narrow my focus of AI and ed to what I call again everyday educational assessment. That is my background. It's been the focus of my research for 25 years. I did my postdoctoral fellowship, for example, at the Center for Performance Assessment at Educational Testing Service. And so I began looking more closely at that. We saw in the mainstream, in the educational media, much of the attention in everyday assessment was focused on test cheating. Of course, everybody saw quite a bit of that. We also saw many calls for sort of alternative approaches to assessment, many very laborious solutions. I'll come back to that point. Um, we saw reports like this one from UNESCO. This was a very common, is we need to rethink assessment and learning outcomes. This was quite common. Um, the U.S. Department of Ed focused primarily on automated grading and scoring, and therefore they were very concerned with the kinds of biases that are built into the large language models being used to score assessments. Naturally, we turned to literature reviews to get a sense of how these issues had been playing out in the literature. Zawaki Richter and colleagues in 2019 reviewed 146 articles. They identified four categories of applications. One of those categories was indeed assessment and evaluation, and it focused really on the usual topics: automated grading, integrity, um, no consideration of the topic to which I care a lot about, which is generating assessment items. Now, there's enough literature already that there's actually two systematic reviews of uh, AI in student assessment. Um, we saw some of the same kind of coverage, but again, we really didn't see much consideration of, for example, uh, generating formative and summative assessment items in the way that many classroom educators would be concerned with. So let's take a step back and put assessment in sort of the broader historical context, really starting in 1998. We saw Black and Willem building on Sadler's groundbreaking work from '89 and really introducing the world to the idea of formative assessment. Um, Nonetheless, many educators and instructional designers uh, really continue to struggle to assess learning. Um, they have issues with validity around traditional item formats, questions about those. They learned quickly that alternative formats are extremely inefficient and time consuming. Most understand that teaching to the test is a big problem, but they don't really know what to do about it. Many struggle to create effective items. Transfer is a very complex concept when you put it into practice in terms of deriving assessment items that capture transfer of learning. The so-called best answer multiple choice items that are the mainstay of professionally developed tests turn out they're really quite difficult for most educators to develop. And then finally, formative assessment. Well, it really hasn't lived up to its promise. Feedback is laborious. There's a whole issue that I'll talk about here with alignment of formative and summative functions, to the point that Randy Bennett, in this important critical review, concluded that formative assessment was an educational urban legend. Now in 2023, well, technology has impacted this situation quite a bit. Um, we know that assessment is particularly important within this massive explosion of online education. Certainly, closed book exams are difficult or impossible in many online settings. However, learning management systems have these amazing power. You can do self-assessment, you can time limit exams, there's automated scoring and item analysis. Those are really powerful, and the pandemic and the explosion of online learning really helped many people appreciate that, but it also led to many calls for assessment reform. This is a typical example here of what we saw quite a bit of. And then, of course, ChatGPT came along and just created these massive new challenges that I talked about previously. Right, the bottom line is that generative AI really can answer most undergraduate test items and many graduate test items instantly. Um, And again, to reiterate, the recommended alternatives that many people out there, I think a lot of people who actually weren't doing the assessment were suggesting that they try in-person exams, oral exams, performance, portfolio. Those things are all extremely time consuming. They're very difficult to do. And in fact, in many settings, they really only provide evidence of what someone did, and they may not really be showing evidence of what someone is likely to do or to transfer that learning in a future setting. Um, for me, the crux of the matter has been this notion of alignment across assessment levels. This has been a centerpiece of my work for really the past 10 years. This idea that you align learning across multiple levels, and in particular, the distinction between what I call proximal, or what a lot of people call proximal curriculum-oriented items. These are from a content, the sort of things that students would complete after an assignment, and that's very different from distal standards-oriented items that are for particular outcomes, the sorts of things that you might ask students to complete at the end of an entire curriculum, uh, for instance, to find out whether they're prepared for an external exam or actually as part of an external proficiency exam. And this alignment of proximal to distal is extremely difficult. And I found that over the years that it's been this big obstacle for me implementing this model behind this multi-level approach that I call participatory learning and assessment. To reiterate, many educators struggle to create high quality assessment items, and in fact, professional item writers are very expensive. I had friends when I was at ETS who were making extremely good money because they were very good at writing items that survived sort of psychometric analysis. They knew how to write these best answer items that would have multiple answers that would appear to correct to all but the most knowledgeable students. Well, Ethan Mollick mentions that, of course, cheap variation is possible with generative AI. You can generate multiple versions of a paragraph or analogies for inspiration in a way that simply wasn't possible before, and you can select from those possibilities. Well, that really works out for assessment, as it turns out. You can create candidate items for review with remarkable efficiency in a way that you simply could not before. And you can also do something else that's quite magical, and that is the process of reviewing items that have been generated with generative AI uh, really positions educators and designers in a way that they can really uncover the nuances of the items for supporting transfer of learning. So I'd like to present an ongoing case study involving a course called Assessment and Learning. This is an online graduate course that I've been teaching and refining extensively since 2009. It's really the basis of my participatory learning and assessment framework. Most of the innovations in that framework that have been published elsewhere emerged first and were piloted and refined in this class. Now, I will point out that it's a little confusing to talk about assessment using an assessment course. I'll try to be clear about that, but it was a big advantage because as a small graduate course, I was actually able to interact with my students. And in fact, Ken Lo took this course as a graduate student before she then worked with me on elements of this course. So we use Popham's fantastic textbook. It's one of the best-selling, if not the best-selling textbook on classroom assessment. I've been using this textbook across, I think, 6 editions now. We focus on chapter 13 on making sense of standardized test scores, and then we also targeted standards, external standards taken from uh, the standards for teacher competence in educational assessment of students that corresponded with that chapter. So what follows is our demonstration of using ChatGPT to create 4 different types of items. These so-called proximal assessments that includes formative assessment from content from the course, and then summative assessments from that content. And then those are aligned to these distal formative assessments for a standard, and then distal summatives. In other words, what I'm going to show you is the process by which we did this alignment both within and across levels. It's a very important function within my framework, and it's extremely powerful for supporting learning. It just turns out it's actually pretty difficult to accomplish for many educators. So first we have creating formative assessments from content. Now, of course, this content likely isn't contained in the large language model. Indeed, ChatGPT really did hallucinate the textbook when I gave it the title and the author of the textbook. It imagined it was a different one. Um, so we actually took a 4,500 word passage, about half of a chapter. Now, what was interesting was ChatGPT 4 said that the passage was too long. ChatGPT 3.5 didn't have any problem. It couldn't handle the 7,500 word, the whole chapter, but it was able to manage 4,500 words. I don't really quite understand these limits, but the only way to find out is to explore with them. What I'm going to show you are formative self-assessments that are the mainstay of my courses. These are presented to students with very carefully worded instructions. Students are instructed to try to answer them from memory, then to use the readings to create a more complete answer, and then to compare their answer with a provided sort of expert answer. And they can really learn quite a bit in a way that doesn't involve any instructor involvement whatsoever. If we do it right and it's aligned to the external or the summative items, it's a really powerful combination for supporting learning. So right off the bat, ChatGPT was astonishingly good at this, frankly, challenging task. I know that I've spent a lot of time writing these items myself in my class, and these are as good, if not better, than any of the items I've drafted. It very quickly identified that there were about six topics in the passage, and it generated one item on standard deviation, another item on grade equivalent scores. These items, if you compare them to the reading, you can see that, those answer explanations are not directly taken from the reading. They're a synthesis of the section. And so a student who was to complete the reading and then attempt these and then compare their answers with that explanation, that's going to be a pretty solid formative assessment practice, which I'm very confident would really support and motivate their learning in the class. Likewise, right out of the box, we said just, you don't have to give the passage a second time. You probably know the ChatGPT. You can just say, now create six multiple choice assessments for that passage. And this is the first round. These are the ones it generated. And you can see again, it gave us one on standard deviation, one on grade equivalent. And these are very well written, high quality items. What's important that these items are somewhat different than the formative assessments. Let's go ahead and compare them. Now again, these are the very first items ChatGPT generated. I did not engineer additional items, but we can see that the multiple choice summative item on the right indeed requires a little bit of interpretation, not a lot, but some from the answer explanation. Likewise, we can see on the second pair of items on grade equivalent scores that you'd have to understand what it means. It's not a verbatim response. However, if a student had, for instance, that text in front of them at the time, they could definitely use that to figure out the answer to the summative item. So that led to the obvious question is, what do we have to do? How do we engineer the prompts in ChatGPT to get more challenging items that capture transfer from the curriculum and the formative assessment? So we said, create six items that require transfer to a new context. And indeed, you see that it did so using standard deviation over range. So it actually asked students to compare standard deviation and range. So it's definitely more difficult, and it definitely opens up to a new context. Likewise, the second one, why is it important for educators and parents to understand the limitations of grade equivalent scores? And so that was a real eye-opening discovery for me, because in my experience, this is very difficult. I have been doing this for much of my career. I've gotten pretty good at it. It's incredibly tedious. It just takes a lot of work. It's not fun. And ChatGPT these are the first ones it cranked out. These are of the six items that it generated, these are the ones. So it definitely is able to think through what it takes to create new items or different items that require transfer or more transfer. Similarly, when we asked ChatGPT to create best answer items, it did so. And you can see here that it said, what are the most appropriate measure, right? And what is the most accurate measure? So you're letting the students know right away, or the test taker know right away, that this is a judgment call. And if you carefully look at these items, you'll appreciate that it really is a judgment call. I'm quite certain that if we were to do item analysis, that this item would be much more difficult than the previous two items. So our first conclusion here is that ChatGPT was really very, very good at creating these items. Um, and really the items right out of the box were pretty strong. Now, if you ask it to create multiple items, you can select from those items. And again, I think that there's enormous power here based on my experience of helping educators and designers learn about this issue of alignment and transfer, that you can just learn about it from looking at the items, at what is a really abstract concept becomes really, really pretty straightforward when you understand the content and you're looking at samples of items like the ones I just showed you, and you can just select pairs of items, for instance, that represent sort of a near and a far transfer. Now, of course, ChatGPT can answer any item that it creates. Um, Now, in my particular course, in the learning and assessment and learning course, this isn't really a big problem. It's a graduate class, and these assessments are embedded within this broader participatory learning and assessment framework. It features public assessments and threaded discussions and engagement reflections. I can look at the students' responses to the private formative assessment. And then finally, the final exams, they're time limited, but they're actually worth very few points. And so that for most students who've completed the other things, the exams are actually quite easy, even though they're quite challenging because we've really prepared them for them. Cheating would be a much bigger problem in sort of larger classes, typical secondary, high school classes, and in many undergraduate settings. And in this case, you probably need to consider the so-called invigilated or in-class exams, or using digital proctors to make sure that students aren't going to ChatGPT. Gosh, you might consider adopting the PLA framework and embedding these kinds of items within this broader framework. And that's really the ultimate goal of my program of research these days. So let's move on to so-called distal items. So again, these are items that are aligned to standards. They're independent of curriculum, the sorts of things that allow you to uh, predict students' performance on actual external achievement tests. Arguably, as long as students haven't been taught to these tests, these sorts of tests, they're actually decent measures for estimating likely transfer of course knowledge to new settings. Also extremely challenging. These are even much, much, much harder for educators. The proximity to the curriculum is often critical. Educators often do things like use the foils from their lectures as foils in the items. That's a big problem. And, overly similar assessment, they're not going to capture evidence of transfer. Um, the case study will use the standards for teacher competence from educational assessment. Again, I found a standard that corresponded very closely. So if I wanted to have a final exam, for instance, that predicted whether or not my students might do well on an externally developed test of professional competency that was created for these standards, this is how I'd do it. Again, right out of the box, ChatGPT was really quite good. I just said he create 6 open-ended formative assessments and answer explanations for the following professional standard. And of those 6 items, 2 of them happen to be corresponded with our content. There's one for the standard deviation, and then there's one for the grade equivalent standard. These are very, very good formative assessment items that are not connected to the curriculum and that would be appropriate for helping a student prepare, for example, for an upcoming examination. Now, this is the kind of situation where prompt engineering comes into play. You can see that I asked for 6 difficult best answer multiple choice items for the standard. It didn't give me best answer items. It actually gave me these correct answer items. What are the advantages? Which of the following? These are not easy items, but they're not particularly difficult. So after a little bit of engineering, I just asked it straight out. I said, give it a best answer item. Each item should have more than one plausible answer for less knowledgeable test takers. And so here you can see, indeed, it came up with what I know from knowing this content. Those are indeed plausible alternatives, A and C, and the answer explanation actually spells that out for our convenience, and that you'd really have to understand, in this case, uh, the principles behind a standard deviation to be confident that that was the correct answer. And we see the same thing here with the grade equivalent standard. Now, one point I want to make here is that notice my prompt says create 6 items, but I narrowed the standard to just standard deviation and grade equivalent score. So in this case, it gave me 3 items for each of those 2 standards, and I selected the best ones from among them. And this is what I mean by this, Ethan Mollick's point about this cheap variation. That's the kind of thing that in my experience, gosh, that's a couple, that's an hour's worth of work at least. And it really was just, a few minutes, an instant to generate the items, and just a few minutes to identify the ones that I thought were best. Of course, now we can subject these items to the typical analysis. We can put them in our learning management system and take advantage of the automated item analysis feature to verify, for instance, do a lot of students choose those options, and are they indeed more difficult than the more straightforward items? So that wraps up our case study. In conclusion, well, ChatGPT really was very good at creating formative and summative assessment items for a particular professional standard. Now, some prompt engineering was in order. That was maybe an hour, a little more, not terribly difficult. Now, I knew what I was doing. I think that we could teach educators how to do that in a simple workshop. Um, Now, I will say that professional item writers, like some of my friends who worked at ETS, they really need to find new jobs because if this hasn't already replaced those jobs, what professional item writers do is create large numbers of candidate items that are then reviewed by experts and inserted into an existing operational test and then psychometrically evaluated. Well, obviously, ChatGPT can do quite a bit of that work for them. Our future work, and what I'm really excited about and working with some colleagues on, is addressing what in the US we call interim tests. These are external tests that are, well, they're being marketed as formative assessments. My assessment hero, Laurie Shepard, wrote this influential chapter called Caveat Emptor, where she warned people, don't be fooled. It's very difficult to use those assessments for anything other than tracking and placement. Um, Very few schools use them for their formative function, but they administer them to students anyways. I know my own state of Indiana, they award school systems $50 per student for administering tests like the Northwestern Evaluation Test. That's a lot of money. There's really no evidence that people are using these tests in any way that actually is improving learning or achievement. We think that we can help schools create their own more effective pairs of items like the ones we've showed you. There's even a possibility, for example, of creating hybrid items that are for content students are familiar with, but that are actually for state standards. So we think that has a lot of promise. We hope you find it interesting, and feel free to email me if you have questions. Thank you very much.